Hi, Jade. Hi, Sheena and the panel, the rest of the panel. I'm going to share my screen. So I'm hoping that this will work out well. And just pulling it up now. And so, you know, I just thought it might be interesting to kind of expand on this idea of what it means to think about fashion and work in combination with one another. So I think my screen is just loading, and I've been really privileged to listen to the rest of the conversations of the day. So I'm really honored, just as the other guests have been, in being invited into today's session. And I thought I'd start, you know, with this idea of fashioning work and fashion work. And the first I'm just going to try to move myself on. First section really takes us, I'm going to go back one, takes us where we've just left off with Sheena. And so thank you so much for sharing Spring Queen and just bringing that kind of reality of the factory floor. And so fashion work, the work of making fashion, and Ilse Wolf's really important study of the Rex Trueform building, and anybody that drives down Main Road is familiar with this building, and the really sort of eyesore of an industry that has been failed by the city. So as a heritage building, this kind of archive that's just being neglected or forgotten. So Ilse is currently working and advocated for this to be attention to be given to this building. But her own research work really looked at the demarcation of labor within that factory space and how architecture conditions certain ways of working, and particularly in terms of gender, race, and class. And then the image on the left, any of you who may be familiar with the Rex Trueform label inside garments might not recognize this particular label because we're familiar with the Rex Trueform label that's inside men's jackets. So for my own PhD at the University of Cape Town, I looked at the clothing collections at Museum Africa, at Iziko museums. And I looked at a range of goods quite closely looking at, and this particular label, I was delighted that I did find it, but it is stitched on the inside of one of the first pairs of women's trousers that were collected and donated to the museum, to Iziko, to the South African Cultural History Museum. And you'll see, so this is just a shot from my PhD. And I talk about this invisibilizing, because if you look at the label, it says man tailored by Rex Trueform. And so this kind of, even in the label, these women were being invisibilized. And so I've started the African Fashion Research Institute in 2019, together with my colleague and co-founder Liebenberg Mabitsela, and his recent research project is called the Cutting Room Project. And Liebenberg has also taken a real sort of close look at this archive of a building, but also this archive of making. So the site of making, Liebenberg's own work is really looking at the suit in particular, and we all know the Rex Trueform suit. So some of you may have seen it, but the Institute for Creative Arts, the ICA online digital exhibition takes you to the Cutting Room Project of Liebenberg Mabitsela. And you will hear some of these narratives of history that has not been given a space in the history books, or not been given a voice in our archives. So as Sheena was saying, you know, so many people don't have the history of what the Western Cape, even the clothing industry, but even going further back in terms of making and industries of making. So I think that's sort of the one part of what I'm presenting. So I'm kind of taking you through into something else. And I think this image, you can see that there's a white lab coat and the coat with the jacket. So we're kind of moving into this idea of how is work fashioned? How is labor fashioned? And this idea of a uniform. And so I was quite interested in thinking about the uniform and how did it start and where did it start? So as an adjective, its entry into the language in the 1500s as an adjective, but it took 200 years before it became a noun. So uniform, the kind of sameness, similarity, the kind of space of being one kind of form to the noun. And it's really interesting to think about the uniform in the 1700s as a clothing and as a fashion item. And some of you may be familiar with the kind of sartorial rules and the sumptuary laws that had determined who was allowed to wear what. And by the 1700s, and in terms of industrialization, different kinds of social rules were required, and the kind of uniform, the uniforming of particular groups of people separate from others. But this uniforming and industrialization and society was then further troubled with colonization. And so in South Africa, the idea of the uniform has a really powerful and deeply implicated past. So on the left-hand side, you can see what is known as the kitchen boy suit. So this idea of dressing particular service and particular home servants. So a kind of allowance into a domestic space by dressing in a particular way and dressing in public spaces in a particular way. And this heritage of the uniform as a site of oppression has deep history. So it was just quite interesting to see Trompi's new album, which is either just about to be released or has just been released, but this kind of new embodiment of the kitchen boy suit, a kind of different kind of wearing. And so my research has always really been looking at fashion, and particularly fashion in the global south. And so this idea that fashion is not only a matter of expressing one's identity, but fashion is perhaps primarily concerned with innovation in the surface decoration of the body, and then in that wider social and cultural responses to that innovation. So the kind of controlling of those bodies through that surface innovation, it would follow then that it is the wearer and the act of wearing that are in fact central to fashion. So this is where I'm starting to think through, what is this thing about wearing and the wearer? So we very often look at fashion and we just think, oh, well, it's something that's a surface that imposes onto the body, but I'm sort of turning it around. And I think, and this is why I chose to do a visual presentation, because how do you explain this image and the impact that this particular image? So when the EFF decided to represent the worker, the proletariat, the working class, they then adopted the clothing of the working class to represent the voices of the working class. So here, a kind of sort of metonym of the worker through the item of clothing that they would have worn. It's a really interesting place of power and disempowerment brought together in this particular dress moment. Whether that has in real efforts really changed the role of the worker and the rights of the working class is part of what I'm also just trying to share today. And And so this idea of work fashion, or worker fashion, and something that I'm going to kind of just try and unpack a little bit here. So I think many of you are very familiar with Sinzeni Maricella's work. And so this is currently on show at Zuidsmacher. And I just want to read a quote. She was interviewed in the Daily Maverick. And in this particular project, she wore a garment that replicated her mother's garment while waiting for her husband. And she wore this as a performance every single day. She went to places, she went as a kind of embodied experience of a woman wearing this item. And so Sinzeni says, I also had a lot of struggles that I didn't anticipate because I was wearing what I thought was a common dress. I didn't anticipate how much I would have to explain myself in spaces, be it buildings or work. Sometimes when I think that about the way I was treated, I think it was so silently brutal. You know, when you're dismissed up until you feel so out of place, from people assuming that because I look that way, I must be hired help, to harassment at borders when I was trying to travel, to being in Joburg and witnessing other women being violated because they look a particular way, to being spoken to in a particular way. It also raises questions about my own body, how one can protect it in a way. And the idea that it is mine and I own it. How much of it do I own? Really provocative kind of questions about this relationship between the wearer or the body and the garment. And so part of the fashion industry is a much broader conversation around sort of the materiality. You know, how do objects become included into our everyday, into fashion lexicon? And many of you might be aware of, because she has presented at Design in Indaba for the last number of years, is Lee Edelcourt. And Lee Edelcourt for the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years has been kind of advocating as a trend, as a kind of global trend, to these kinds of authentic materials, these kind of real world, simple shapes, functional details. And so this kind of presentation of workwear that was then presented at Design in Indaba, and the kind of highly problematic images, and this is where I'm kind of sort of pushing back, and I'm saying these highly problematic images, because where are the Black bodies in these images? They are kind of styled with white bodies as a kind of double erasure of the worker. And this idea of workwear, so this is a really interesting artist, Hendrikje Schimmel, and she creates these sculptural pieces, but she says she's now obsessed with the chore jacket, the blue worker's jacket that everyone's wearing, especially in London. It's the urban middle class that wears it, especially creatives with no chores to complete within the context of what that jacket was intended to be used for. It has started to live a life of its own as a kind of uniform for creative people. So it's a kind of multiplicity, highly, highly problematic shift of a garment from one space, layered in meaning into another space. And something that isn't straightforward, it has to do with status and taste. So I think many of you might be familiar with Mary Sabanda's work, this one from 2009, this kind of reimagining of the uniform, of the domestic uniform, this kind of expressive kind of reimagining of it, taking it, making it far more fabulous than it is, expanding it. So this, again, this idea of the chore and the kind of separation from labor. And so I'm just coming back to Lee Edelcourt again, because I think I don't think she had this in mind when she says clothes in common. I explored the idea of fashion that's similar. So instead of being unique, you dress like everyone else. But when everyone else dresses like that, you dress a little bit different within that idea. So your difference is minor because you want the comfort of being the same, and that there's a comfort in similarity. So I don't think she had quite had Mary Sabanda's minor differences in mind in terms of like, but this idea of this comfort and similarity. And this is where, I mean, it's a really important and complex issue that needs addressing. And that's why I'm saying it's such an important conversation that this whole seminar is really presenting. And so I placed here an image that I would call the discomfort of similarity, because these boxes are not tidily packed, they're not tidily arranged, that sellotape is discomforting, the angles are discomforting, we don't know what they are. And there is a discomfort in the similarity. So this is Johnson's workwear, and every year Johnson's workwear, there is unsold stock, or what they call dead stock that doesn't sell. And so in Cape Town, there's a very successful company called the Clothing Bank, and they take dead stock or unsold stock from all sorts of retailers and the industry, and then they continue and they sell it on with an empowerment group, empowerment workshops, and an investment into individual women's lives. But this Johnson's workwear cannot enter into something that's aspirational because it's workwear. So there's a kind of lock in terms of how do we deal with selling workwear as something that's desirable, as fashion, as desirable. And so this is where I'm sort of seeing there's been a real shift in not only local designers, but internationally as well. And so I'm really questioning what is going on with this idea of workwear as fashion. What is happening when local designers, and we've got Art Club and Friends, and we've got Wren, and this kind of lab coat, this kind of sort of the aesthetic of the worker has kind of shifted into more mainstream and aspirational fashion languages. And is this marking a shift? Is there some kind of recognition of perhaps some kind of change, some kind of social change, or some kind of broader change around production or around labor? And I think all of us have been very aware of COVID in the last year of celebrating essential workers. Essential workers are being considered most important and key figures in our society. But the fact that 1 in 4 essential workers still have trouble affording basic household expenses during the coronavirus crisis speaks to something that there's a value, there's a social value around work and around labor that places essential workers right at the bottom of some kind of rung. And so the highly problematic place of the worker. So I'm using fashion as a kind of entry point. And I'm coming back to this idea of the wearer. It's not just fashion as a decorative, but fashion as the wearer. Can we speak about the wearer in some kind of way? And is there a way where we can rethink work and labor? And so I'm going to finish with this quote from Rolando Vazquez, and this is from 2010 already, so it's already over 10 years ago. And it's this idea that why is it that commodity, whether we're talking about fashion in this particular case, but I think just in terms of cars, computers, travel, everything, the commodity is pervasively visible, but the common people are marginalized and remain invisible. So I think a thread throughout, hopefully my presentation, and I think also just the stories that we've kind of shared and listened to today with other panelists is this idea around visibility, and can we shift thinking about human beings in very different and fundamental kind of ways, and perhaps through fashion as an entry point into that conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erica. I think your presentation would help equip us with the vocabulary to understand the fashion language a little bit more, and how fashion as its physical manifestation and as an industry informs so many different aspects of our lives and our expressions of identity. So thank you so much.